Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be here this morning and a great turnout. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you some reflections on the housing market. Over the last number of years, I've had the opportunity to talk to people right across the public sector and the private sector. So I have a perspective, and a fair amount of experience in relation to the housing market as it is at the moment. Some of the areas that we're specifically working on in relation to the funding of social housing in the country, and also things such as mortgage to rent, which is one of the interventions in relation to dealing with the mortgage issues. I'm going to just touch on a lot of issues. Now, if anyone wants more detail on those issues, please feel free to email me. So I'm just going to touch on the points, but the points that I'm making are not made lightly. There's quite a lot behind anything that I'm saying this morning. I just want to very briefly look at housing supply and demand, just to put it in context. I do want to talk about house prices and valuation methods that we use, because it's one of the critical areas, I think, that we have to address. And then I want to talk about the market, the housing market in general, and some of the issues I think that are affecting the market. And you're going to go through a number of those issues, such as unfinished housing estates. I'm going to touch on planning again, and touch on the change that I think is needed in terms of us moving on. Firstly, I just want to very briefly look at supply and demand, and just in a very simplistic way. You've all seen the graph, all the graphs, by the way. If you ever do a presentation, all the graphs for Ireland look like this, so you can. This is the housing supply graph, and as we all know, it went up to 90,000 housing apartments per annum there by 2006-2007, and then a very rapid fall off. There is very little housing supply now. It's mainly one-off houses. There are some other developments being finished off, but it's mainly the housing supply currently is one-off housing around the country. In relation to demand for housing, there is an underlying demand. We have got a serious problem about not having a flow of properties being built, and the demand is of the order of 20 to 30,000 homes per annum is what we should be supplying, that we need to supply. Now, the bulk of the demand is around the Greater Dublin area, and that's where the demand is. Much less demand other parts of the country, except for the major cities. I think Billy might be speaking about this later on. So that's just to put it in context. We have got very little supply, but there is a building up of demand for housing in the country, even taking account of the demographic changes and emigration. I want to just talk about property valuation, and specifically in relation to house prices. Is something that I feel very strongly about, and what I'm concerned about is all the focus has been on the percentage house price falls. We just have that constantly reported. How much have house prices reduced by? What percentage have they gone down by? And all the focus has been on that, and all the reports in relation to that. It hasn't been, I don't think, very useful to focus on that. So the first thing I say, just forget about what house prices were. In some way, I know they have serious effects on a microeconomic scale in relation to individuals and in relation to people who own property or who are involved in development or who provided loans. Obviously have a very serious effect. But in terms of what house prices were, I think we should put to one side. And we have to go back in terms of valuing property. The use of comparables, and the method that we're using to value property, have got some use, but maybe less use and we should be putting less reliance on those methods of valuation. Going back to the old saying, an asset is worth what someone is willing to pay for it. It's very important to remember. In relation to valuation, I think much more focus has to be on valuation based on end user value. That's for any property. What is the value of that property from the perspective of the end user, and to put much more focus on that than the use of comparables in relation to the valuation of property. In relation to specifically house prices, you can look at in terms of what is the value of a house from a number of perspectives. Is one, if someone is going to buy a house or an apartment, is what can they afford to pay? One measure is a percentage of household income, and it shouldn't really be more than 30%. During the boom years we were going up to 50, 60% of income in some cases. Another, and probably one of the most useful, most reliable measures over the years has been a multiple of income. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And an absolute max really should be 4 times income, and possibly less than that. Valuation based on rental income and an appropriate yield. So that's an extremely useful method of looking at the value of properties, particularly in Dublin, an area where there is a strong demand for housing and a strong rental market. You can very easily value a lot of the apartments and other properties by looking at the rental income. And if you use rental income, you'll use the annual income, multiply it by 14, possibly even only 12 times the annual income as a measure of the value of that property. The other measure, particularly if we need to supply housing, start supplying housing, obviously developers isn't going to develop housing if they're going to get less, sell it for less than the cost to construct. So we do at some point have to get to a situation where the cost of construction plus some land value as a method of evaluation. But I feel very strongly in relation to how we look at values. And actually, if you want to look at properties, forget about the percentage drops. Look at the individual properties and what they're worth. House price to income ratio. It's an extremely good. If you want to measure any market, it's an extremely good measure and been a very reliable measure over the years. Where we went awry, one of the things we went awry, we had all these affordability indices being produced, and as interest rates fell on mortgages, people could afford more and more, and as credit relaxed. So it was based on particularly interest on mortgage interest is a very dangerous figure to be using in terms of looking at a person's ability to pay. Anyway, the house price ratio is a very simple measure, a very useful measure. And I say during the boom, it had gone up to 8 times income. It got to ridiculous figures. There's the graph in terms of the average house price to income ratio, and it went up. In 1996, it was 3.5 times income, and it's now back down to that level again. In England, they've been looking, at setting specific rules and regulations in relation to lending and in relation to house price to income ratio, and they're considering going down to 2.5 to 3 times income, as a ratio. The person there who's in charge of that commission is Lord Richard Best, the commission in relation to lending practices for mortgages in the UK. I just want to touch on the state that we're in, the situation that we're in. We're still in this unreal situation, and a lot of us still haven't accepted the situation. We have much more austerity. The country has taken very serious measures, but often, and a lot of people I meet from across the sector, the various sectors, they still have not changed their mindset, and we really need to change in order to move on. The market, in terms of the housing market, the market generally, it is not operating, or operating to a very limited extent, and we can't function unless we get the market operating in some fashion. There is a very significant waiting game. Many of you may say, look, you're taking decisions and you are moving on in a lot of respects, but still there is a significant waiting game being taken by lenders, developers, receivers, everyone. We're all to blame in terms of how slow we are dealing with things. Decisions tend to be extremely slow in terms of trying to do transactions. We were involved in trying to buy property there at the end of 2010, and it actually was nearly impossible to do business. People weren't making the decisions even when you wanted to buy, and it was across the sector. It wasn't just property owners, lenders, even solicitors. Got into this certain mode, and things were just taking too long, and you couldn't have decisions weren't being made. So we need to get. There has been a lot, maybe more movement in the last year or so, but we need a huge lot more movement. And I just ask you all, how are we going to get the market working? Because we do have to get the market working. I'll just touch on some of the issues in terms of the terminology that we use, and just be very careful, because I find a lot of us are taking comfort in various things, and we're looking for signs. We're looking for signs of change, and we can get maybe sometimes too much comfort in some of the terminology that we use. As you all know, a number of years ago we had this word soft landing, and we all know now that was just fictitious and wishful thinking. And we probably all knew deep down there's never such a thing as a soft landing. But similarly, today we're using terms such as bottoming out, a market floor, levelling off, and we're getting comfort, in that terminology. And I think actually it's somewhat dangerous. You have to be very, very careful in thinking in that way. If I was ask you, when did houses stop selling? In terms of the main bulk of new houses, when did they stop selling in this country? Would anybody? Yeah, so end of 2006, 2007, that they stopped. That was 5 years ago. So we've had a situation where the market has stopped, for that period of time already, which is not insignificant. Just taking a graph, of what's happened in a number of countries post their crash, just to explain that graph, and it's from the work that was done by the OECD. If anyone wants the full report, it was given by Christophe Andre at the Irish Council of Social Housing conference last year, and he did a very good analysis very detailed analysis of the Irish market. So if anybody wants a full copy of his presentation, I'll give it. I can send it to you. What this shows is actually it looks at various countries and it looked at going to the peak, and then years. The bottom axis is the number of years after the peak. And I've just taken three countries: Ireland, which is in the red line, Finland, which is in the light blue line, and Japan in the black line. So if we look at Finland, very similar actually graph to Ireland. The same is true of both Norway and Sweden. Very same profile. And in Finland, you're talking about 4 years, whatever, going from peak to trough, and then there was another 4 years where there was very little movement, as stayed along the bottom before it gradually increased and has now recovered. 21 years after, has recovered to the levels that they were at. And say that's the situation in Norway and Sweden as well, although in those two countries house prices have increased to a greater extent. So our graph, Ireland's graph, is quite similar to the Finnish graph, but in terms of whether we get out of it, often depends on what we're going to do. If you look at the Japanese graph, and it's been tailing off, and has not recovered. So there is lessons. We have to be careful in terms of what we do. The automatic situation where we're going to hit the bottom and come back up does not necessarily happen. It depends on the decision we make and how we deal with things. In terms of the Japanese situation, and it's not dissimilar, one of the serious problems that Ireland has, as we all know, we have very serious fiscal problems and very serious banking problems in Ireland, if anybody didn't know. But in Japan, quite similar banking issues, and I have quite a very good presentation done by the former Japanese director of the IMF, Daisuke Kochigawa, who did a very good analysis of what happened over the period in Japan. He's a person who closed a lot of Japanese banks. Actually, I went to a presentation of his a year before we went into the IMF, and he had Ireland listed as a clear candidate for the IMF. So most of the countries that he listed are now in. The one country that he did list that isn't in the IMF yet is England. It was one of the other countries that he predicted would be coming in. But one other just key issue that he said, and he was extremely strong, very un-Japanese in terms of the way he gave his presentation, but that he said just close the zombie banks. He says Japan dragged on for years because it didn't deal with even they had the same bailouts as we had here, a small bailout and then a larger bailout, but until closed off all the zombie banks, it was difficult to move on. If anybody wants his presentations, just send me an email. In terms of the economic, I just want to very briefly look at the economic reality that we're in, and in terms of the decisions we have to make in terms of dealing with it. We have very limited resources. From the state's point of view, there isn't the capital. There isn't the capital funding there to fund capital projects, specifically in relation to housing and the Department of Environment. The capital expenditure reached a peak in 2008 of 1.4 billion. In 2 years' time, that will be down to 200 million. So a very dramatic reduction in the amount of capital available. There is revenue funding, current funding available, and we have to make that work in terms of how we deal with housing. renting instead of buying, and taking a longer approach, longer-term approach. An awful lot of people are still fixated at trying to make the quick buck, to do a deal, to move on, and I find that disconcerting, the number of people who just want to do a deal and walk away from it. That isn't possible anymore. The only way we're going to deal with things if we deal with things in the long term. This is maybe a particularly important slide from my perspective. We need to get an active residential investment market. We really need, in order, the banks have no money, even those of you who are from the banks here, the reality is the banks have no money and will not have money for a good number of years, or a very limited amount of money. The state has no money, so the source of money is investment. Investment in its broadest sense, investment abroad into property, into even mortgage lending. The mortgage lending, if we're to change it, the mortgage funding has to come through investment that's then lent out by the banks. The banks have got very limited amount of money and won't, and I don't think will have. We have to get into more of a culture of building to rent in the future. We have to get investment in the market. We need to build up property portfolios. So we really need to get to a situation, and a number of banks and NAM are maybe focusing on that area now, is to put together property portfolios that have a rent roll that are attractive to investors. I think that's absolutely critical. And we really need a more professional property management sector. We have too many landlords that have one or two properties. We need large-scale and high-quality property management, and we seriously need to move in that direction. From the point of view of social housing and the investment from the state, it's primarily around the rental of social housing in the future and the leasing of housing. And if anyone wants further information on that, you get it on our website, housing.ie. I just want to touch on an issue of just one aspect of mortgage arrears. To say, currently, one of the areas that we're working on is on mortgage rent, which is one intervention in terms of dealing with mortgage arrears. But we really seriously need to deal with the, as we all know, the mortgage arrears problems and the level of negative equity people have in properties. Matthew Elderfield last week said we do have to do a lot more in terms of dealing with arrears, and it does need action. I'm going to touch on just one issue in terms of, again, interventions in the market that are actually slowing action. Is the mortgage interest supplement, which is typically someone who household where they've lost their jobs cannot repay their mortgage, that the state provides a supplement to go towards paying the interest on that mortgage. I won't go into the details, but the amount has increased very significantly over the last number of years. There's now nearly 19,000 households in receipt of mortgage interest supplement. Now, one of the drawbacks of that is actually it means that lenders are not taking action. If the state are paying the interest on the mortgage, well then you can maybe afford to sit back, and maybe it's not prudent to take more action in relation to it. The mortgage, the two reports on dealing with mortgage arrears, which very welcome and very important. reports, but they primarily focused on the financial matters in relation to mortgage arrears. There was very little assessment of the societal impact of arrears, and no regard in terms of the psychological impact of uncertainty in relation to people that are in mortgage arrears. Just from my own experience in terms of dealing with redundancies and that, to leave people in a situation where they're in limbo and they don't know what's going to happen, the person is actually better off getting the bad news than being left in limbo. Somebody wants to know where they stand. So leaving a situation where it's dragged on and dragged out isn't very it isn't appropriate. It isn't psychologically good for people. So we do need to look at the effects on society and effects on individual, in addition to the financial aspects. But we do need seriously to deal with the mortgage arrears issues. I'm just going to then touch on a number of issues. Firstly, I just want to look at unfinished estates and particularly the developments where there's housing that's complete or nearly complete and unoccupied, and the effect that that's having on the market. In terms of the unfinished housing developments, in areas where there is a demand for housing, and a lot of the unfinished housing developments are in areas where there is a demand for housing, we need to finish off any of the housing that is nearly complete, get it into use, and either sell it or rent it. Sitting and leaving the property there is pointless unless you've decided to write it off altogether. It is in a totally unsuitable location. But we need to get that stock cleared before we move on. And so we need to make the best use we can of that stock. The other thing I'd say, anyone who's finishing off property, particularly in relation to making it available for rental, is actually to pay much more attention to making that property easy to maintain and reduce management costs. Because in the past we just built to sell, and there was very little regard to the running costs of buildings or the maintenance of buildings, and it's to the detriment, particularly of our apartment buildings. But we need to put a lot more focus. So if any of receivers or lenders or developers spending money finishing off the developments to rent, is focus on management and maintenance of that stock. Some of the issues, and any who are dealing with the unfinished developments, they're very difficult, often from the planning perspective. There's Part 5 issues in terms of Part 5 agreements need to be completed and negotiated. Bonds, security and bonds are often a major issue in relation to tidying up the situation, and then development contributions. So there's often a lot of planning issues around the unfinished housing developments. Just want to touch on very, very briefly on planning and the current trend, which we all know is apartments have got maybe a bad name in terms of some recent events, particularly in Priory Hall. But there has been a move. People now want to buy houses and not apartments. That's going to be very difficult to resist. So there will be much more focus maybe on more housing and less apartments. But we really need to ensure that we get sufficient densities and sufficient concentrations of population in terms of being sustainable in the future. Just a couple of other planning issues, maybe particularly I say this to local authorities. Our approach to planning has to change, and most importantly is to get greater consistency across all local authorities in the country. There's in a lot of areas there is not enough standardisation in terms of even down to zoning maps and development plans. It needs to be a much greater standardisation and consistency in terms of approach in the planning system. In relation to Part 5, say there are some, a lot of legacy issues in relation to Part 5. There's likely to be changes ahead. Our agency, the Housing Agency, are commencing a review of Part 5 with a view to making amendments to Part 5 in the future. But that's going to happen over the next couple of months. Just to start wrapping up, and in terms of the change that we need in order to move on, because in terms of there's no point waiting. In order to move on, we have to change our approach, or we won't get out of the situation that we're in. Investment is needed. The one thing I think is absolutely critical is our financial sector hasn't got money. The state hasn't got money, so we need to attract investment and investment across the board in a lot of areas. As I said earlier, in relation to housing, it's investment, building up property portfolios and having investment in the residential market. It isn't considered, the residential market isn't considered an investment market in Ireland, which isn't a good thing, and we need to make it into an investment market. And in areas such as mortgage lending, we need to attract in investment in relation to the mortgage lending that we provide, because that's the only way that we'll get the money. The change that we need is we do have to make the market has not been working. It is maybe a little bit better in the last year, but the market isn't working. People are still sitting and waiting, not making decisions, or hoping that we'll reach the bottom and things will be better next year. So we have to make the market work, and we have to maybe reduce the level of intervention in the market. We must clear, in terms of the housing stock, particularly in areas where there's housing that's in, and I'm talking about the unfinished housing developments mainly, where they're in locations where there is demand for housing. We need to get that stock cleared. I say, not just sell, rent, if not sell. We need to attract investment, as I spoke about. We must, I believe, take action, and stop waiting, and anything we can do to make a difference. And just to finish off, if any of you who are in the sector is look at what changes can you make. In order to bring about major change, you need to start with small changes, but start making changes in order to bring about major change. Thank you very much.